I learned two things during my first morning at Reed Auto Works. First, customers could smell a new employee from across a parking lot. Second, Mason Reed apparently believed smiling at them was dangerous. "You're doing it again," he said. I looked up from the computer at the front counter. Through the open doorway behind him, pneumatic tools rattled somewhere inside the service bay. "Doing what?" "Letting them distract you." Mason stood there holding a work order, his dark work shirt marked from a morning spent under somebody's truck. I'd been employed for less than 4 hours, and he already had the expression of a man reconsidering every decision that had brought me into his workplace. "I'm talking to customers," I said. "That's literally my job. Talking, not adopting them." I laughed. He didn't. That was more or less my introduction to Mason. I'd taken the front desk job because I needed steady work, and by lunchtime I was beginning to think I might actually be good at it. I could handle appointments, explain estimates without making people feel stupid, and keep 3 conversations moving while the phone rang. Mason was different. He was efficient, blunt, and clearly more comfortable with engines than people. Which was why what happened that afternoon caught my attention. A customer came in to collect his car. He was probably around my age, friendly enough, and while I pulled up his invoice, he leaned against the counter. "You just start here?" "First day. Good addition." I glanced at him. "You haven't seen me mess anything up yet." "I'm willing to take the risk." He smiled. I smiled back. Before I could turn the screen toward him, Mason appeared from the service bay. "Everything okay?" The customer looked over. "Yeah." Mason stayed. I waited. The customer waited. Finally I said, "I've got it." "I know." But Mason still didn't leave. He asked the customer a question about the car that had already been answered on the work order in his hand. Then another. Nothing rude. Nothing I could reasonably call out. But the easy conversation at the counter disappeared. The customer paid, took his keys, and left. Mason watched the glass door close behind him. Stared at Mason. "What?" "You tell me." He put the work order on the counter. "His tire pressure needs checking again next week." "That isn't what I mean." Mason's eyes narrowed slightly. I had known him for 1 shift, which probably meant I should have kept my mouth shut. Instead, I leaned against the counter. "Were you jealous?" For the first time all day, Mason looked genuinely caught off guard. Then his face closed again. "Of what?" "That guy talking to me." A beat passed. Mason picked up the work order. "I was watching the customer," he said. "Right? Not you." He turned and walked back toward the service bay. I watched him disappear between 2 raised cars, telling myself I'd imagine the whole thing. Then Mason glanced back through the doorway to see whether I was still looking at him. I was, and this time, he was the one who looked away first. By Wednesday, I had learned that Mason's definition of watching the customer was remarkably flexible. The morning started quietly enough. I was entering an appointment when a man picking up his sedan stopped at the counter and looked at my name tag. "Ethan, right?" "That's what they tell me." He laughed. "You're new. Is it that obvious?" "Only because I'd remember you." Before I could decide whether that counted as flirting, Mason came through the doorway from the service bay. He walked straight to the cabinet beside me and opened it. I watched him remove a clipboard. There were 6 identical clipboards hanging in the bay. The customer left a minute later. Mason turned to go. "Important clipboard?" I asked. He looked at it, then at me. "Very." By Thursday, I started noticing a pattern. Mason didn't care when customers asked me about repair times, complained about prices, or told long stories about mysterious noises their cars only made when nobody else was listening. He cared when they got personal. One man asked how long I'd been working there and somehow turned that into a 5-minute conversation about where I liked getting lunch. Mason called my name from the bay. I went back there. "What?" He pointed at a work order. "Did this customer approve the brake pads?" I looked at the paper. There was a large check mark beside brake pads. Approved. I looked at Mason. He looked at the paper. "You called me back here for this?" I was confirming. "You can read. So can you." I folded my arms. "Was my conversation bothering you?" "No, good. I'd hate to think you were jealous again." I wasn't jealous the first time. I smiled. Of course not. His jaw tightened just enough to make the smile worth it. The strangest part was that his behavior wasn't consistent enough for me to dismiss him as simply territorial about the shop. An older customer spent 10 minutes telling me about his fishing boat while I processed an estimate. Mason never looked up. A woman waiting for an oil change chatted with me through most of her appointment. Nothing. But later that afternoon, a guy leaned against the counter, complimented my smile, and asked whether I worked every weekday. Mason appeared beside me less than 30 seconds later. Ethan. I turned. Yes. I need you in the bay. For what? A pause. The Peterson invoice. It's on your desk. Another pause. I know. The customer glanced between us, clearly amused. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. When the man finally left, I found Mason beneath the raised hood of a car. So, I said, no, I haven't asked anything yet. You're going to. I leaned against the nearby workbench. You only seem to need my help when someone is flirting with me. Mason kept his attention on the engine. That's not true. Then apparently the shop develops a lot of emergencies whenever a man compliments me. He finally looked at me. For 1 second, something in his expression made the joke disappear from my mouth. Then he reached for a tool. Customers come here to get their cars fixed. And I'm here to talk to them. Then talk. I do. Good. I waited. He said nothing else. I walked back toward reception, smiling despite myself. Maybe Mason genuinely believed every interruption had a perfectly reasonable explanation. But after 4 days at Reed Auto Works, I knew one thing. Mason didn't mind customers talking to me. He minded when they wanted me to keep talking after their cars stopped being the subject. By the following Tuesday, I had stopped wondering whether Mason had a pattern. I was wondering how long he planned to pretend he didn't. The afternoon rush had filled the service bay, and I was halfway through returning 3 calls when a familiar face walked through the front door. I recognized him from the previous week. Daniel, right? He smiled. You remembered. Your car remembered for me. That's disappointing. I was hoping I made an impression. I pulled up his service information. Looks like you're here for the follow-up inspection. And apparently better conversation. From the bay, an impact wrench stopped. I didn't look toward the doorway. Daniel stayed at the counter after I checked him in. He could have taken one of the waiting chairs, but instead he rested his forearms on the counter while I finished entering his information. So, he said, survived your first week? Barely. I knew you would. You had tremendous faith in someone you met for 5 minutes. I'm optimistic. Mason appeared beside us. Of course he did. I'll take his car. I looked up. It's already assigned. I know. Then why are you taking it? Mason held out his hand for the keys. Daniel gave them to him, looking entertained. Personal service, Daniel said. Nice. Mason's expression didn't change. We try. He disappeared into the bay. 10 minutes later, he came back. Inspection looks fine. Great, I said. Mason remained beside the counter. Daniel glanced at him. So I can leave? When Ethan finishes the paperwork. I was asking Ethan. Mason's jaw moved once. I looked down before either of them caught me smiling. Daniel's car didn't need much, but somehow Mason found 3 separate reasons to update me personally. Each time, Daniel was still standing at the counter talking to me. By the 3rd visit, even Daniel had noticed. When Mason returned to the bay, Daniel leaned closer. Is he always like that? Like what? Daniel nodded toward the doorway. Like he wants to replace me with a transmission. I laughed. I'm serious. He says he's just doing his job. Sure. I finished Daniel's paperwork and slid it across the counter. He signed it, then looked at me instead of leaving. Can I ask you something that has nothing to do with my car? From somewhere behind me came the metallic clatter of a dropped tool. I resisted the urge to turn around. Depends. Would you want to get coffee sometime? There it was. Simple. Direct. And before I could give him an answer, Ethan. I closed my eyes for half a second. Then I turned. Mason stood in the doorway. Yes, Mason? I need you back here. For what? His gaze flicked toward Daniel, then returned to me. The work order. Which one? A pause. The one on my bench. Daniel was openly smiling now. I walked into the bay and stopped beside Mason. What work order? Mason picked up a sheet of paper. I looked at it. You already completed this. I wanted you to check it. You wanted me to check your handwriting? His expression hardened. I lowered my voice. He asked me out. I heard him. I figured. Mason looked toward the reception area, then back at me. You should get back up front. I stared at him. That's why you called me back here? I needed the work order checked. No, you didn't. He said nothing. I stepped closer. Not enough to touch him. Only enough that he couldn't escape the question by staring at an engine. You know, for someone who doesn't care who talks to me, you spend an incredible amount of time interrupting them. I never said I don't care about customers. That isn't what I said. His eyes met mine. The noise of the shop suddenly seemed farther away. Then Mason handed me the paper. You can date whoever you want. I looked down at it, then back at him. Really? Yes. I took one step toward reception, then stopped. Because you certainly don't act like it. This time, Mason didn't call me back. Daniel didn't ask me about coffee again that day. Maybe Mason's interruption had killed the moment. Maybe Daniel had decided I came with more workplace drama than one cup of coffee was worth. Either way, I told myself I didn't care. What bothered me was Mason. 2 days later, Daniel came back because he had a legitimate question about the follow-up inspection. I was at the counter when he walked in. Please tell me I'm allowed to talk to you today. I laughed. I haven't seen any new shop rules. Good. I could feel Mason somewhere behind me without looking. Daniel asked about the inspection first. I answered, pulled up the service notes, and explained what he needed to know. Business finished. He stayed. So you never answered me. I noticed. Coffee offer still stands. I glanced toward the service bay. Mason was working beside an open hood. He wasn't looking at us. For once, I decided not to make things easier for him. What kind of coffee? Daniel smiled. That sounds promising. A tool struck metal harder than necessary behind me. I kept my eyes on Daniel. You have to answer the question. Whatever kind convinces you to say yes. That's a dangerous amount of confidence. I'm willing to risk it. We kept talking. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing that interfered with my work. Daniel wasn't blocking another customer, and there was no paperwork waiting for me, which meant Mason had absolutely no reason to appear. He appeared anyway. Ethan. I turned slowly. Yes. We've got work to do. I looked around the empty reception area. I'm caught up. Daniel lifted both hands. I can go. You don't have to, I said. Mason's expression changed. Barely. But I saw it. Daniel saw it too. He gave me an amused look, told me he'd see me later, and left. The moment the door closed, Mason said, You shouldn't encourage customers to hang around. Something in me snapped. He wasn't interfering with anything. He was distracting you. My work was done. That's not the point. Then what is the point? Mason looked toward the bay. I stepped around the counter. No. You keep doing this. Then pretending you're talking about work. I am talking about work. You told me I could date whoever I wanted. You can. Then why does Daniel asking me for coffee bother you? It doesn't. I laughed once without humor. You took over his car when you didn't need to. You interrupted him when he asked me out. Today you came up here because we were talking after his business was finished. He's a customer. So this is a workplace. And you're my coworker, Mason. Not my father. Not my boyfriend. His eyes locked onto mine. The word hung. They're longer than I expected. I felt it too. That only made me angrier. If I want to talk to somebody after I've finished helping them, you don't get to decide whether I can. I never said I did. You just act like you do. Mason went silent. I lowered my voice. Why do you care? His face became unreadable again. Because we work together. I stared at him. That answer might have worked on my first day. Not anymore. Coworkers don't watch each other like that. For a second, Mason looked as if he might finally say something real. Instead, his gaze dropped away from mine. From the bay came the ordinary noise of work waiting for him. Mason stepped back. I have a car to finish. Of course you do. He returned to the service bay. I went back behind the counter. Neither of us apologized. Neither of us mentioned Daniel again that afternoon. But something had changed anyway. Before, Mason could pretend I hadn't noticed. Now he knew I had. And I knew that whatever was happening between us had stopped being funny. For the rest of that afternoon, Mason kept his distance. The next morning, he did the same. If he needed something from reception, he asked for it without lingering. If a customer talked to me longer than necessary, he stayed in the service bay. He didn't invent work orders for me to check or suddenly discover urgent reasons to stand beside the counter. I should have been relieved. Instead, I noticed every time he didn't come up front. Near closing, Daniel walked through the door again. Mason was in the bay, finishing work on a car. I knew he had seen Daniel because his hands stopped moving for half a second. Then he went back to work. Daniel approached the counter. I'm starting to think my car likes this place too much. Your car isn't the one who keeps coming inside. That obvious? Very. He smiled. This time I didn't look toward Mason. Daniel rested one hand on the counter. Okay, I'm gonna try this one more time. I already knew what was coming. Coffee. With me. No cars involved. I opened my mouth. Ethan. The voice came from directly behind Daniel. I looked up. Mason had crossed the shop. Daniel turned. Mason's expression was controlled, but there was nothing professional about the tension in his shoulders. His paperwork is finished, Mason said. Daniel blinked. I wasn't asking about paperwork. I know. Silence. Daniel looked at me. I could feel heat climbing into my face, but embarrassment disappeared beneath something sharper. Mason. He looked at me. Back in the bay. Now. His eyebrows lifted slightly. I didn't wait. I walked past him. A few seconds later, he followed. I stopped beside his workbench and turned around. What was that? What was what? Don't. His jaw tightened. You knew exactly what he was asking me. He was holding you up. No, he wasn't. Mason looked away. I stepped into his line of sight. You told me I could date whoever I wanted. You can. Then stop acting like this. I'm not acting like anything. I stared at him. You crossed the entire shop because Daniel asked me for coffee. He's been coming in here repeatedly. And that bothers you. He's a customer. We already did this. Mason went quiet. I felt my frustration rising, but beneath it was something worse. Hope. I hated that his jealousy had started giving me hope. So I forced myself to ask the question I had been avoiding. If you're not interested in me, then who I date is none of your business. Mason's eyes snapped to mine. And if you are interested, I continued, then stop pretending this is about customer service. For once, he had no immediate defense. The service bay seemed unnaturally quiet around us. I waited. Mason looked toward reception, then down at his hands. Finally, he said, I don't like it. My heartbeat changed. Don't like what? His eyes returned to mine. Watching him flirt with you. There it was. Not a joke. Not an interruption I could interpret however I wanted. I swallowed. Why? Mason exhaled slowly. Ethan. No. You don't get to stop there. His expression tightened. You wanted me to admit it bothers me. Fine. It bothers me. That isn't what I asked. I know. Then answer me. He didn't. That silence told me almost as much as the admission had. Almost. I stepped back. You can't keep getting jealous every time another guy talks to me and then refuse to tell me what it means. I'm not asking you to do anything. That's exactly the problem. Mason frowned. You want all the benefits of caring without having to admit you care. You interrupt people. You watch me. You get angry when somebody asks me out. Then the second I ask why, suddenly we're just co-workers. His face changed at that. Not anger. Something more exposed. But he still said nothing. I shook my head. Being jealous doesn't give you a claim on me. I know. Then act like you know. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Finally, Mason nodded once. It wasn't the answer I wanted. But it was the first time he hadn't lied to me. I walked back toward reception. Daniel was gone. I stood behind the counter staring at the paperwork in front of me without reading a word. Mason had finally answered one question. Yes, he was jealous. Yes, seeing another man flirt with me bothered him. But now I had a question that felt much more dangerous. Because if Mason wanted me enough to be jealous, but not enough to say what that meant, I had no idea what I was supposed to do with the truth. The next morning, Mason kept his word without ever saying he would. He stayed away from the front counter. When I needed information from the service bay, he answered the question and went back to work. When customers talked to me, he didn't appear beside me with a clipboard, a work order, or some imaginary emergency. For the first time since I'd started at Reed Auto Works, Mason gave me exactly the space I'd asked for. I hated it. Not because I wanted him interfering again, because now I understood what his absence meant. Every time I glanced toward the service bay and didn't find him watching, I remembered how often I had before. By the second day, the distance between us had become its own kind of conversation. Late that afternoon, I carried a completed service form into the bay. Mason was at his workbench reviewing another order. I set the paper down. Customer approved everything. Okay. I started to leave, then noticed the stack beside his hand. 3 completed work orders. I recognized the names. One belonged to the guy who had complimented my smile. Another belonged to the customer who had spent 5 minutes asking where I ate lunch. The third was Daniel's. I looked at Mason. Why did you take these? His hand stopped. What? These jobs. They needed doing. There are other mechanics. Yes. But you volunteered for all 3. Mason didn't answer. I picked up Daniel's order. You took this one when it was already assigned. I remember. And this guy. I touched the second paper. You called me into the bay while he was talking to me. Mason's expression closed. Suddenly the pattern looked different. I had thought Mason kept finding excuses to come to reception whenever somebody flirted with me. Maybe that wasn't the whole thing. How long? I asked. He knew exactly what I meant. Ethan, how long have you been doing this? He looked away. I waited. Finally, he put down the tool in his hand. Before Daniel. My chest tightened. How much before Daniel? Mason gave a short, frustrated breath. You want me to say it? Yes. His eyes met mine. I noticed you your first day. I didn't move. He continued before he could change his mind. I kept finding reasons to come up front. Sometimes there was work. Sometimes there wasn't. The clipboard. His mouth tightened. I almost laughed, but the moment was too fragile. And the work orders? Same thing. You volunteered for jobs because I checked those customers in? Sometimes. Why? Mason stared at me as if the answer should have been obvious by now. Then he finally said it. Because I wanted to be near you. The words landed harder than his admission of jealousy had. Daniel hadn't created anything. He had only made something Mason had already been doing impossible to hide. I thought about my first shift. Mason appearing beside the counter. His unnecessary questions. The way he always seemed to know when someone's attention stopped being about a car. You liked me before any of this started. Mason looked uncomfortable with the word, but he didn't deny it. I was trying not to. That worked well. A faint, reluctant smile touched his mouth and disappeared. Then the distance returned. Knowing the truth should have made everything easier. Instead, it made one thing painfully clear. Mason wanted me. He had wanted me long enough to rearrange pieces of his workday just to find reasons to stand near me. But wanting me and choosing me were not the same thing. So what happens now? I asked. His expression changed. There was the hesitation again. The retreat. I don't know. I nodded slowly. That hurt more than I expected. Right, Ethan? No. It's okay. It wasn't, but I understood something I hadn't understood before. I couldn't force Mason across the distance he kept creating between what he felt and what he was willing to do about it. I put Daniel's work order back on the stack. Then I returned to reception. For the rest of the shift, Mason stayed in the bay. This time, when I noticed the empty space beside the counter, I didn't wonder whether he wanted to be there. I knew he did. The question was whether wanting me would ever be enough to make him walk across the shop without an excuse. By Friday afternoon, Mason and I had become very good at working together without talking about anything that mattered. He no longer interrupted customers. I no longer teased him about jealousy. If I needed an estimate, he gave me one. If he needed approval from a customer, I got it. We were efficient, polite, and completely aware of everything we were refusing to discuss. Then Daniel walked through the front door. I looked up from the computer. He smiled. Bad time. No, for a second. My eyes moved automatically toward the service bay. Mason was there. He looked at Daniel, then at me. I caught myself and turned back to the counter. That small reflex irritated me more than it should have. I had been doing it for days, looking toward Mason whenever another man showed interest, waiting to see what he would do, waiting for him to decide something. Daniel rested his hand on the counter. I feel like I should ask before your mechanic finds something urgently wrong with my car. Despite myself, I smiled. He's not my mechanic. Daniel studied my face for a second. Okay. The word was gentle enough that I knew he understood more than I wanted him to. Then he asked, coffee after work? No joke this time. No careful opening. Just a question. I looked toward the bay again. Mason had stopped working. Our eyes met, and suddenly I was tired of waiting for whatever answer I hoped to find there. I turned back to Daniel. Yeah. His eyebrows rose. Yeah. Coffee after work. His smile widened. I'll take it. We agreed on when to meet, and Daniel left. The door had barely closed when I felt Mason's attention from across the shop. He didn't come to the counter. That almost made it worse. Near closing, I was organizing the last paperwork when Mason finally approached. Are you really going? I kept sorting the forms. To coffee? Yes. That's generally what happens after you tell someone you'll go. Ethan. I looked up. There was no irritation in his face this time. No possessive edge. Just something dangerously close to worry. What do you want me to say, Mason? He glanced toward the door Daniel had walked through earlier. You know I don't like him asking you out. I know. And you're going anyway. Yes. His jaw tightened. I set the papers down. You told me you wanted to be near me. You told me you were jealous. But when I asked what happens next, you said you didn't know. No, I wasn't angry anymore. That surprised both of us. You don't get to do this halfway. Mason went still. You don't get to look at every guy who talks to me like he's taking something from you, while refusing to say I'm something you actually want. I told you I want you. You told me you wanted to be near me. The distinction landed. I stepped out from behind the counter. I've spent 2 weeks watching you say one thing and do another. Then yesterday you finally told me the truth about why you kept coming up here. Mason said nothing. But knowing you want me doesn't mean I'm supposed to stand here indefinitely while you decide whether you can admit what you want to do about it. His eyes stayed on mine. I'm not asking you to wait. I know. That was exactly why I had said yes to Daniel. I picked up my jacket from beneath the counter. Mason watched me. You like him? I barely know him. Then why go? Because he asked. Mason flinched slightly. Daniel had done in 4 words what Mason had. Spent 2 weeks avoiding. I softened, but I didn't take the answer back. You don't get to act like I belong to you while refusing to choose me. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then I put on my jacket. I'll see you Monday. I walked toward the door. Mason didn't stop me, but just before I stepped outside, I looked back. He was still standing beside the counter. For the first time since I had started working there, Mason wasn't hiding behind a car, a clipboard, or a work order. There was nothing left between us except the decision he had been avoiding. And this time, I wasn't going to make it for him. I made it 3 steps into the parking lot before I heard the shop door open behind me. Ethan. I stopped. For 2 weeks, Mason had called my name whenever he wanted to pull me away from another man. This time, I almost kept walking. Then I turned. Mason stood outside the shop with nothing in his hands. No clipboard. No work order. No customer problem he could use as an excuse. Just Mason. What? I asked. He came closer, then stopped several feet away. I was unfair to you. That wasn't what I expected. Mason looked uncomfortable, but he didn't retreat. I kept telling myself that as long as I didn't say anything, I wasn't asking anything from you. I waited, but I was. His eyes stayed on mine. I wanted your attention. I hated watching other guys get it. And every time somebody flirted with you, I acted like I had a right to interfere. Mason, let me finish. So I did. You were right. Being jealous doesn't give me a claim on you. And wanting you doesn't mean you should wait around until I figure out how to say it. The parking lot suddenly felt very quiet. Mason took a breath. I kept hiding behind work because work was easy. I know what to do with an engine. I know what happens if I make the wrong choice and how to fix it. A nervous edge entered his voice. I don't know how to fix this if I get it wrong. There it was. The thing underneath every retreat. I looked at him. So what are you choosing? His hesitation lasted only a second. You. One word. No excuse attached. Mason. Stepped closer. I want you, Ethan. Not just your attention. Not just the right to get jealous when somebody else asks you out. My heartbeat was loud enough that I was surprised he couldn't hear it. I want to take you out. I want to know what this is when neither of us is standing behind that counter. And if you tell me I waited too long, then I'll deal with that. He swallowed. But I'm done pretending I don't know what I want. For the first time since I'd met him, Mason had nowhere to hide. And neither did I. You realize this would have been much easier if you'd said that before Daniel asked me out 3 times. I know. Instead of stealing his repair jobs. I know. Or inventing paperwork emergencies. His mouth twitched. I know. I tried not to smile. Failed. Mason noticed. So, I let him wait for another second. I'm not choosing you because you got jealous. His expression sobered. Good. I'm choosing you because you finally stopped making your feelings my problem to solve. Mason nodded. Then I stepped closer. And because I've wanted you to ask me for a while. Something changed in his face. Relief first. Then a smile I had almost never seen at work. What about Daniel? I owe him an honest conversation. Mason nodded again. No interruption. No claim. No attempt to make that decision for me. That mattered. I looked back through the shop windows at the front counter where this whole ridiculous thing had started. So, I said, are you actually asking me out? Yes. Coffee? Mason grimaced. I laughed. Fine. Something that doesn't remind you of Daniel. That would be better. I reached for the door handle behind me, then stopped. You know what the funniest part is? What? The first day I asked if you were jealous. Mason closed his eyes briefly. And you told me you were watching the customer. I remember. Not me. I remember that too. I smiled. Terrible liar. Apparently, this time when Mason looked at me, he didn't look away. And for once, there was nothing left for me to interpret. He had spent 2 weeks letting his behavior say what he refused to admit. Now his words finally matched it. Mason wanted me, and more. Importantly, he had chosen to do something about it. Monday morning felt almost disappointingly normal. The phones still rang. Tools still rattled in the service bay. Customers still arrived, convinced the strange noise their cars had been making would somehow disappear the moment a mechanic listened for it. The only difference was that Mason and I no longer had to pretend nothing had happened in the parking lot Friday evening. We weren't suddenly different people. Mason was still quiet. I still enjoyed making him uncomfortable. But now, when our eyes met across the shop, Neither of us had to wonder what the other one meant. Late that morning, a customer came in to pick up his car. He was friendly, around my age, and apparently in no hurry to leave after I handed him the paperwork. "You always work Mondays?" "Usually." "Good to know." I smiled politely. From the service bay, I felt it. I looked over. Mason was watching us. The customer kept talking. Mason stayed exactly where he was. No clipboard appeared. No mysterious work order required my immediate attention. No vehicle suddenly needed a question answered. I finished the transaction, handed over the keys, and watched the customer leave. Then I looked back toward Mason. He was still watching me. I raised an eyebrow. He returned to the car in front of him. At lunch, I found him at his workbench. "You were jealous." Mason didn't look up. "Was I?" "Oh no, we're not doing that again." That finally made him glance at me. I didn't interrupt. "Congratulations. Tremendous personal growth. I thought you'd appreciate it." "I do." I leaned against the workbench. "But you were still watching." His eyes stayed on mine. Months ago, though somehow it had only been weeks, that would have been the moment he invented an explanation. The customer looked suspicious. He needed to monitor reception. There was work to do. Anything except the truth. This time, Mason simply said, "Yeah." I smiled. Yeah. I was jealous. And I trusted you to handle it." That answer mattered more than I expected. Because the problem had never really been Mason looking at me. I liked when he looked at me. The problem had been forcing me to guess what the look meant while he refused to take responsibility for it. Now I knew. Mason stepped closer, keeping the easy distance appropriate for the middle of a workday. "We still going out after work?" "That depends." His expression immediately became suspicious. "On what?" "Whether you can make it until closing without inventing an emergency every time somebody talks to me." "I think I can manage." "Very confident." "I'm willing to take the risk." I recognized the line and laughed. Mason's smile appeared slowly. Then someone called his name from the service bay, and he turned back toward work. I returned to the front counter. A few minutes later, another customer walked through the door. I greeted him. Across the shop, Mason glanced over automatically. I caught him doing it. This time he didn't look away. Neither did I.